Viapafema ek miedjihuen jakametama abarchaukio. Miufirjich jachuam abarchaukayo. Jaizochina juam fiseslechietai. Momin yerm fi yahi. 10 years ago, almost to the day, a Geography Now video came out on Andorra, and I was immediately fixated for years and years on geography, and then language, and then linguistics overall. Neo. Spain cat, Spain cat, Spain cat, Spain cat. Are you an Erskal Katua? Is that what you are? Probably botched that. You get the sentiment. 5 years ago to this day, my friend Chris and I decided that we wanted to create a YouTube channel similar to Geography Now, where we talked about the languages of every country in the world specifically. And we started with Belgium, but we didn't end up releasing that video until later. The video that released on this day 5 years ago was my introduction to Arodjun Katao, as I called it at the time, and a presentation of the theme to Avatar: The Last Airbender, the opening line to Avatar: The Last Airbender. Alrighty, it's time to give a brief snapshot on the progress of Arodjun Katao or Mierhua Katao, depending on, whether it's an endonym or an exonym. So here we have what I'm working on right now. We have Siadmanib Yidyuch Watim Yuzyuch, Syntax and Morphology of Imperial Arodjun Katao. This current gloss might be slightly outdated because I did this before I wrote the main bulk of the paper. So you have like Chujiao, Fuhao, Hihiao, Trixiao, and then which is water, dirt, flame, and wind instead of water, earth, fire, air. That video released on November 2nd, 2019, 5 years ago, half a decade ago. Less than a year later, I became a Fulbright alternate to go and teach English in Andorra for a year, inspired by my obsession with Andorra from Geography Now all those years ago. But then COVID happened, and it canceled the Fulbright trip for that year, so no Andorra for me. COVID also canceled my honors thesis presentation. My honors thesis presentation on the Arodjun language. So I turned that into a live stream on my fledgling YouTube channel.
Are you pumped? Are you excited?
Oh, I'm pumped. This is the epic culmination of everything that I've been working on for decades.
Or an aspect language. So could you say a little bit more about that? How you've chosen these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categories?
Where Nya and Ru are both, they're definitely both more, the moods, right? The moods are there as separate words. And it worked out pretty well. Then Eternal helped me typeset and put together a publishable version of the Arodjun book, which published in August of 2021. And then in late 2021, early 2022, I started working on the drafts and then eventually the full pages for the comic Jojawa Joror, or Dog Days. And that is still ongoing today because I've been extremely busy. I'm still finishing up chapter 2 as we speak, but it is going on. The point is, 5 years ago, I published the first actual video on this channel. Arodjun was the basis for this channel, but after all of these years, I've talked about Arodjun a lot. I've developed Arodjun a whole lot, changed it massively since I did my first thesis defense, and I've even added a bunch of stuff onto it since I published the book, which could potentially warrant another book. I've done showcases on other languages in the Dog Days world, multiple of them, several of them, talked about all the language families in the world and how they come together, but I have never done a proper showcase on Arodjun until today. Again, I want to thank everybody who has been here over all these 5 years, this half of a decade, where you could see the obvious aging of my face as the world shattered me. And and hopefully we get 5 more and beyond. Let's keep on nguhing all over the place. That sounded weird. Asa Bazinet and David, thank you both very much for becoming patrons in the past month. I greatly appreciate you. You are legendary just for the mere essence of your being. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. So, with that all being said, hey everybody, welcome to Nguh. And I present to you the Arodjun Conlang Showcase. Finally. Agma Schwa is recorded in front of a live studio audience. Viewer discretion is advised. Parts of this slide didn't load. Try reloading. What? Bruh. Welcome to the Arodjun Showcase. Yet another Cern Cahilan language. In fact, the first Cern Cahilan language that I made. Arodjun, or Kat Jarodjun, as it's called, is a Cahilan language spoken on the western coast of Menaicharam, centered around the Fuanal Peninsula, a landmass that is situated off the west coast of Mexico that does not exist in our time, but at some point in the 2 million years since humanity's destruction, the peninsula appeared. And it is a very, very strategic and a geographically important region in the world in the time of Zhōzhāwā There are minority Arodjun-speaking populations throughout much of the western Menaicharam. This is, by a large margin, the Conlang that I've worked the most on in my entire life. It's the primary readable language of my comic Zhōzhāwā and it's the primary lens through which I justify the creation of my other languages in this world. And it's still not done. But to celebrate the 5-year anniversary of this channel, here is a full-length showcase, finally, after all these years. And it's still only gonna just scratch the surface. There's a lot more I could talk about than what I have in the next many, many slides. So in this showcase, I'm just gonna go over the classics that I talk about in my showcases. History, phonology, phonotactics, orthography, descent from Thvasvan, some grammar and syntax elements, various special grammatical features, and then the sample text as usual. As you may have seen in one of my recent videos, this is the family tree of the Cern Cahilan languages. And some of the earliest branches off from that Cahilan mainline branch were the Fun and the Proto-Arodjun branches. And those would prove to have a lot of interesting relations with each other that would eventually yield Arodjun among many other languages. So after the dispersal of the Proto-Cern Cahilan groups, the Cahilan branch moved west from the Roraima in the Mississippi River area. One of the first groups to split from the main Cahilan branch in what we would call northwestern Mexico by 3000 BR being before the rediscovery of human technology. The Proto-Fun groups had settled most of the Fuanal Peninsula, pushing back speakers of Kernkla and older unidentified language families. Around 1500 BR, another branch, the Proto-Arodjun, moved into the northern peninsula and were able to conquer much of the region. Proto-Arodjun descended groups formed various kingdoms and other polities in the northern portion of the peninsula, while the Proto-Fun descended groups became established in the southern and eastern regions. Initially, the ancient Fuanals, based in the city of Domun, or the future site of Eastern Reuhuan, because Rook City is enormous, had the most power and creating multiple empires that generally overpowered the Arodjansan kingdoms, with a few exceptions. In the 800s BR, several wars led the many people groups of the peninsula to be under either Fwanal or Arodjansan control, and established an enforced border between the two for the first time. This was considered a ceasefire line of sorts, or a demarcation line. The First War of the Peninsula, between 752 and 744 BR, was an enormous conflict that enveloped the peninsula and yielded an Arodjansan defeat. This marked the beginning of the First Fwanal Empire. During the First Fwanal Empire, significant efforts were made to teach the Fwanal language in former Arodjansan lands, after the languages had already been influencing one another for centuries. Ruxalusha, a cultural area that had begun as a home for Pakoyan refugees centuries earlier, had become a major cosmopolitan city in the heart of the peninsula by this point. So there was a lot of mixture between ancient Pakoyan, Imperial Fwanal, ancient Arodjun, as it was labeled at this point by modern scholars, and ancient Irkun. Arodjansa became independent from the empire within less than a single lifetime. Its focus shifted to the seas, and it gradually created a huge network of oceanic trade throughout the region, establishing communication with other Kahilan groups that have been isolated from the others for over 1,000 years. The empire had given Ruxalusha autonomous status, and languages were permitted to fully coexist there where it was restricted elsewhere. The dialects of Pakoyan and Fwanal spoken there at the time evolved quickly, and the region became more and more well-renowned. After the ecological disaster caused by the failure of the Fwanal Dam, along with other political and environmental factors, the Fwanal Empire fell rapidly during the 120s BR. The Delsh Akavate formed to fill in this power vacuum, and Ruxalusha, which had a huge Arodjun-speaking population by this point, became an independent city-state in the heart of the peninsula. And by 1 AR, Ruxalusha's population was majority Arodjun-speaking, or ancient Arodjun, that is, and it was by far the most powerful city in the peninsula, and it quickly became one of the richest cities in the entire world. The dialect spoken in and fomented by Ruxalusha by 200 AR was essentially an Arodjun-based Creole mixed with the older Pakoyan Fwanal Creole. This became known as Reuhikat, or the language of Ruxalusha. The Fwanal language, once the lingua franca of a massive region, in less than 200 years had become essentially unpractical for people outside of the Fwanal heartland to speak. This rapid decline led to Delsh and Reuhikat becoming the most practical languages to speak around the peninsula. A second Fwanal Empire managed to form in the late 200s AR, but by this point Reuhikat Arodjun was being used in those territories as well. Arodjansa and Ruxalusha joined together in the 300s to defeat Fwan and were successful. Over the next 2 centuries, Ruxalusha became independent again and expanded its territory over much of the former Fwanal territory except for the island of Fwan itself. Arodjansa conquered Pakoya and the rest of the western peninsula. Both groups spoke dialects of the same Reuhikat language at this point. And after several wars, including the brutal tripartite war of 581 AR and a full-scale invasion of Ruxalusha by Arodjansa in 711 AR, the entire peninsula was finally unified into a state that modern scholars call Fwan Arodjun. Wow, I wonder what the 2 parts of that word can mean. By this point, the late Fwanal language was relegated to the studies of ancient texts. Its writing system, the eloquent system, or Jotarang, was modified and was still being taught in Fwan and Ruxalusha. Middle Arodjun formed during this Fwan Arodjun period, which was beginning to resemble the modern form. Several sound changes occurred, which made communication easier across different regions of the peninsula. The next big linguistic change occurred when the Prince Empire invaded, and using modified human technology, they rapidly conquered the peninsula and much of the world. You've heard me mention the Prince conquests in several of my other showcases before, and the Fwanal Peninsula was not immune to this. In fact, it had a big impact. Between 1278 and 1304, the Fwanal Peninsula was conquered by the Prince Empire, and a region in northern Arodjansa, now known as Soterval, was heavily colonized by the Princei. During Prince rule, the Prince language had significant influence on Arodjun. A decimal numeral system was also forced upon their society, replacing most elements of its previously dozenal system. This period only lasted about 75 years before the Princei had spread themselves too thin, and political chaos in their homeland caused the outer reaches of the empire to collapse. A significant prince population remained in Soderval, though. Ruksalusha greatly benefited from the Prince period, and its capital, now called Ruk City, was by far the wealthiest city in the peninsula, and perhaps the entire world at the time. Permachico, meanwhile, situated in what we know as Mexico, had been expanding for centuries. After the infrastructure and technology of the Princei had been left to a new Permachican dynasty called the Span, Permachico and its language became extremely widespread and powerful. After the very, very convoluted War of the Pearl from 1546 to 1563, the Permachican Empire had conquered all of the Fuano Peninsula. I briefly mention all of this in the Permachican showcase, but I could literally make like an hour-long documentary about the War of the Pearl because it's extremely complicated. I explain it in a little more detail in the Arodjun book in the history section, but I have way more detail even than that written down. That maybe if you really want it, I'll make a video on that. Comment War of the Pearl me now if you want to see War of the Pearl lore, because it's really interesting. Permachican rule lasted from 1563 until the conclusion of the Elfwonk Revolution in 1847. The Permachican rulers, unlike the Princei, had no interest in influencing and integrating the culture. They really only cared about resource extraction and control the monetary systems. Thus, Arodjun continued to develop with less Permachican influence, though speaking Permachican was a great way for an Arodjanzan to get ahead. Even though Permachico ruled over the Fuano Peninsula for much longer, it didn't have nearly as much of an effect on the language. The people groups of the Fuano Peninsula eventually put aside their differences, temporarily, to launch a long but successful rebellion against the Permachican government by 1847. The tribes, as the Permachicans called them, had their leaders convene to create the Charter of Elfwonk Casanosha, or Etlefwonk Kulinoslia, thus forming a confederation of the several nations that had competed against one another at various points throughout history. Various rebellions and conflicts occurred over the years, with multiple groups not wanting to be a part of Elfwonk Casanosha anymore. Nevertheless, the country persisted, and modern Arodjun had largely come about by 1900 AR. Several dialects exist, reflecting historical linguistic regions, and several languages descending from Arodjun have formed over the years. By 2000, Arodjun was one of the most important languages in the world for business, alongside Prince, Nashin, Alkin, and Cern. And by 2067 AR, this is what the spoken range of Arodjun looks like. With the dark red region mostly focused around the Fuano Peninsula and a couple various oases and other pockets around the Fuano Peninsula being the areas where the majority of the population speaks Arodjun as their first language, and the paler red areas speckled throughout what we would call Mexico and the western United States all the way down to Panama would be areas where Arodjun is spoken as a minority language or a language of commerce, but not necessarily the native language of the majority of the population. I discussed this like over 4 years ago, but there are several different names that the language could be called. In English, I often call it just Arodjun, and that is also an adjective in the language, Arodjun. It is used by the citizens across the Fuano Peninsula to refer to the language in relation to its origin in the city of Arodjun, or the region of Arojjanza, which means the island between the rivers, because the Arojjanza and the site of the city of Arodjun is located between two rivers. Big plot twist. It could also be Arodjunk, which is an exonym. It's used by citizens from regions of the southern half of the peninsula to refer to the dialect of the Arojjanzan people, typically in a moderately derogatory way. You also have Katjarodjunk, which is the noun. It is an academic term used within and without. It is used by academics to describe the language, citing its origins in the city of Arodjun. It's kind of political in its connotation. Arodjunkat is also a noun. It's used by Arojjanzans to describe describe the language that they speak in the form of a noun. Arodjun Katao is used by anyone in the Fwanal Peninsula to describe the literal sound of the language. The act of people speaking it, the sounds they're making is Arodjun Katawa. Additionally, there's Fwongkat, another noun, used by citizens of the southern and southeastern portions of the peninsula to refer to the language they speak, which is also a little bit political in connotation. Additionally, Katjofwonk is the noun, the academic term, used by academics to describe the language, referring it to be a separate language from the Arodjans and derived language, slightly political in connotation as well. Fwonk, as well, is used by people who are ethnically Fwanal to describe their language as inherently belonging to them, and that's very political in connotation. Miarhuacatao is another noun, which is actually the original title of this language before I changed it to Arodjun, and it's used by citizens across the peninsula to describe the manner in which the people speak in general. It's used by aristocrats to refer to the linguistic variations of people living in the big cities. And then there's also Katjokaslenozliach, which is used by citizens of the peninsula to describe the language, labeling it as a lingua franca of the nation of Elfwan Casanosha, more than anything else. Very high register term there. And of course, as I've discussed in all of the other showcases from Cern-Cahilan languages, Arodjun is descended from about 6,000 years of linguistic change from Proto-Cern-Cahilan, or Thasfan, and many things have changed. And you have to remember, in world, nobody knows that the Cern languages and the Cahilan languages are even related. That's how long it is. It's like a crackpot, Altaic tier conspiracy theory. But we know it's true. And just as a meta note, if you remember me from long ago, from long ago, I made Arodjun first, and then I made Thasfan reverse derived from it. And even though I made it work, I just have to say that was a horrible mistake. Do not do that. It's not the end of the world if you do that, if you're not planning on making like an enormous and fleshed out language family. Like if it's just for one language, which it was at the time. I just wanted the ancestor of Arodjun. I didn't think I was going to be making all of the other ones, but I did end up making all of the other ones. And so reverse deriving it was horrible, and it's making my life more difficult to this day. So I do not recommend. Just like with the other showcases I've done, I've showed some of the evolutions of some root words from Thasfan into the modern language. So you could see here just a list of things, right? And this one also has the added benefit of showing the Paramachican and Alkan equivalents. Some of them are more similar than others. I'm currently working on creating a unified single root word dictionary for all of the Cern-Cahilan languages. And because of the reverse derivation that I did 4+ years ago, that process has been way too difficult. So it's gonna be really cool when it's done, but it is sure a lot of busy work. But this is a little sneak peek of the complete Cern-Cahilan dictionary that I'm starting to put together. And you can see just how a lot of them have changed. You can look at all of those if you want. And that full dictionary I'll be making a video about someday. The phonology of Arodjun has remained relatively consistent over the years, but the way I've documented it has changed quite significantly. I think like 4 times I've changed the way I wanted it documented. I think that this right here is the definitive way I will display the consonant phonemes in Arodjun from now on. Those being ma, na, pa, ba, ta, da, cha, ja, ka, wa, b, t, k, fa, va, sia, za, hla, hla, ha, ja, ha, wa, ya, and hua. And there are 6 main vowels in Arodjun: a, e, I, o, u, and However, there is also a large set of falling diphthongs, including I, al, ow, a, el, ya, u, oi, o, ui, uo. There are technically rising diphthongs too, but those are just written with the glides ya and wa, so they don't need to be identified as diphthongs, but rather as just a glide consonant followed by a vowel. Alright, and these are generally the phonotactics for Arodjun. a CC-VCC structure, where C1 and C3 can be any consonant. C2 is generally restricted to ra, wa, and ya, though there may be a couple exceptions. And C4 is generally ka and kha. There may also be a couple exceptions. And V can be any vowel or diphthong vowel. All right, on to the stress patterns. Now this is probably the most complicated part of the whole language, to memorize at least. So verbs and nouns and adjectives have two different sets of patterns, right? So to the right, you can see the noun pattern here. And that noun pattern, again, it also applies to adjectives and adverbs. So think of this as nouns, adjectives, and adverbs. Everything except for verbs follow the patterns listed in this chart here to the right. Those are the unmarked forms, by the way. And you'll see that I say N-class noun and I-class noun, and then a section for adjectives and adverbs, right? An N-class noun is any noun whose root word ends in something other than I. Sometimes there are nouns where the root word ends with a letter other than an I, a different phoneme, usually a consonant phoneme other than I, but the final vowel in the root was an I, and that is an I-class noun. And any other root word, any root word that doesn't either end in I or have its last vowel be an I, is a N-class noun. And then adjectives and adverbs follow their own rule. There is also a distinction between the final vowel sounds in some adjectives and adverbs for irregular marking, as you'll see on the next slide. But for an example that follows this pattern here, an N-class noun, like patikhao for container, stress is on the first syllable because it is either a 2 or 3 syllable word. And this is based on the root word's syllable count too as well. So keep that in mind. An I-class noun example would be auyatich. As you can see, it doesn't end with an I, but the root word does. And thus, there you go, auyatich. It gets it on the ultimate syllable. For an adjective, there's viakach, which means killed, and it's on the second syllable, which is also the ultimate syllable. And same situation for an adverb like fiarach, which means seriously. Then you have the stress patterns for verbs. So this pattern shows the verb strength hierarchy in order, with om, and im considered the strong verbs, and em and verbs considered the weak verbs. Now, this is not the same kind of strength as with Germanic languages. This is literally just about the syllable stress structure. So here is a strong verb in quotation marks, orom, and that means to shine. Then you have a weaker verb, which ends in that is chichum. And then you have amankum, which is to hold, ends with 3 syllables, right? Penultimate syllable gets the stress. And then ponim, another strong verb, which gets its stress on the ultimate syllable, being a 2-syllable verb. And then it comes down to marking the irregulars. And also some of the regulars as well. This is one of the most complicated parts here. So variations from the stress pattern are marked with geminated consonants or lengthened vowels. Often these are phonetically interchangeable, but in writing it is required to follow the rules to the right. Also, some verbs are always marked with lengthened vowels or lengthened consonants. Like as you can see, I have it labeled whether it's always something that gets marked or just the irregulars being marked, and whether those are marked with a doubled vowel or a geminated consonant. It may seem convoluted looking at it right now, but trust me, it's actually like a logical system. It makes sense if you look at the structural underpinnings of it. For example, the strong verbs that end in am, om, and im are always given a double vowel on their stressed syllable. Meanwhile, verbs that end with em and the weak verbs, are always written with geminated consonants following the stressed nucleus. And all of the others are irregulars, as in for verbs which are 2 syllables and end with em or the stressed syllable gets a double vowel. Just when they're 2 syllables though. The same applies in the opposite direction for two-syllable am, om, and im verbs, where the irregulars are given geminated consonants instead of the doubled vowels. Then when you look at the nouns and the adjectives, if you have an N-class noun with an irregular stress pattern on it, then it will have a geminated consonant following the stressed nucleus. An I-class noun or two-syllable N-class nouns will instead be marked with a double vowel when they're irregular, and so on. The system makes sense. The system is very regular for marking irregulars, if that makes sense. And here's like some examples, right? The verb hahim has the two I's there, to burn, right? Kurum has the two R's, the kurum has the two U's there, even though a um verb usually wouldn't have that. It would have a doubled R's instead. Then you have netem, to slow down with the two T's, dujam, an irregular am verb there with the two G's geminated as it's written. They're both basically phonetically the same. It doesn't matter, but you get the point. So on and so forth. There are occasionally clusters of consonants or consonants that are written with digraphs, and those need to be specified somehow in the writing as to whether they should be, as to which sounds need to be doubled, which letters need to be doubled. So for this situation here, a mankum with two N's or a mankum with two K's. I made this mistake myself many times as I was developing this. You may even see a mistake or two like this in even in officially written out things that I've done in the past. Apologies retroactively for those. If the irregularly stressed syllable ends with a codal consonant and the following syllable begins with another, then the second consonant is the one that's supposed to be doubled, and thus a mankum with two K's is correct. Now, if a single consonant is written with a digraph, like KX for ch, then the gemination will be shown on the first letter instead, specifically to show that that is a digraph being lengthened and not two different sounds where the other one is being lengthened. Also, if a stressed vowel is a diphthong, it either doesn't get altered at all or the following consonant gets geminated, right? Like the EI right there, A, that will often be fine on its own. Also, there are lots of irregulars, especially with verbs whose intransitive forms are only one syllable. In these cases, the intransitive will often just double the vowel, and its transitive form will double the M in the ma transitive verb morpheme, which we'll talk about later. So just keep that in mind. The verbs that I've been showing have all been intransitive verbs, all of which end with M, right? Transitive verbs end with ma, or several other options which add a symbol to the overall word. This does not affect the double vowels or consonants. Imagine the rule as applying to the intransitive verb, and then you just add the extra vowel or change the verb suffix as necessary. The intransitive verb to count something, like just to count bonukutem, right? Then the transitive version adds the a and technically adds another syllable to the word, but it's still bonukutema. All that talking about romanization spelling, we got to talk about the actual writing system. So this is the Jopetoj system written down below, but Arodjun has two writing systems. Jopetoj is the most common one, and it's phonemically based. For the most part. It's a simple alphabet which follows the same quirks that I discussed utilizing the romanization earlier in terms of doubling either consonants or vowels, but it also has a few symbols that are mixed together just for the sake of making writing more efficient for common phoneme clusters. This is the writing system of Jopetoj. It's got lots of letters. As you can see, the vowels have two versions. First, they have their independent versions, a, e, i, o, u, and then they also have, for every one of them except for they have their palatalized versions, or the ya, ye, yi, yo, you forms. And that's because those clusters happen a lot. And so a lot of the time you'll either see the ya suffix used with the normal vowel, or you'll see space saved by putting a dot or sometimes two dots into the existing vowel symbol. It's just a time-saving method that's become official in the writing system. Additionally, there are a couple special symbols for adjectives like the jo symbol and the via system. Their origin will be discussed soon. That's right, the jo-darang system, something that some people have been asking me to talk about more for a long time, and I never had any reason to do it because I couldn't really make a full-length video about it. The jo-darang writing system is derived from the ancient Fwanal writing system, which is an alpha syllabary system where the macro symbols that occupy a whole syllable have individual consonants and vowels drawn above and below the nucleus. Consonants go below the nucleus and vowels go above the nucleus. So there it is. Those are the symbols. A little bit more complicated than a lot of the Jopetoj symbols. And you can see that the sequence of the sounds goes from bottom to top. The consonants that are on the bottoms of each of the syllable polygraphs are the ones that begin the syllable. If there is no consonant that starts the syllable, then that consonant space on the bottom will be blank. There are two options for nucleus space. There's a simple nucleus, and then there's a palatalized nucleus. Every one of them has to have a nucleus of some sort, and a lot of the time, if a syllable has a palatalized nucleus and doesn't have any consonant other than ya, you'll still have the ya symbol put in there just to occupy that space because it's more satisfying, I guess. The same goes for consonant clusters and vowel sequences, where just based on the order in which they appear, they'll just be stacked right on top of the other vowel or the other consonant. And if there is no nucleus, if these are just extra symbols added on, like extra sounds added to the end of the word, then those symbols go in their order from bottom to top, but there's no nucleus mark because they're not part of an independent syllable. It implies to the reader that those sounds are just part of an existing one. Both of these are used. Jopetoj is much more common, right? It's used throughout the peninsula, while the Jotarang system is used only in practice in Fwan and in Rook City. And elsewhere it's learned as a novelty, or it's learned by philologists to read ancient texts. However, those Jo and Via adjective prefixes that were visible on the Jopetoj diagram are often written in Jotarang to save room on a page. Sometimes other prefixes are as well, but most of the time it's just the Jo and via prefixes, because those adjectives happen a lot. Obviously, they're adjectives, and almost every adjective has a Jo or a via marker put onto it, so it just saves a lot of time and space on a page for a writer. Cities and organizations will also often create stylized logos out of the Jotarang writing just to look classy and official, and sometimes Jotarang letters or syllables will be used to capitalize in quotation marks, because it has the same effect, but it's not really thought of that way. But you could think of it as capitalizing proper nouns or words that begin sentences, especially in official documents. And in less formal circumstances, proper nouns are usually just written as a larger version of the normal Jopetoj letter. There's no actual graphical difference. And there are also parts of Arodjanza and Soderval where the Prince language had the most long-lasting influence, and there Prince letters are often used instead of Jotarang letters to capitalize the proper nouns. And we talked about the numbers in the history, but before the Prince conquest, Arodjun numbers were fully base 12, dozenal. The Prince takeover of the economy and education system forced it to become a mostly base 10 system, but multiple of 12 still have special names though. So as you can see, these are the systems. On the right you have the modern base 10 numeral system. Both of these pages are excerpts from the book, by the way, right? And you can see where the base 12 elements of it were just stripped away in order to be utilized in the Prince government. On to the grammar. In short, it is a VOS grammatical order in Arodjun, but you could also think of it as a mandatory verb, optional object, optional indirect object, subject, genitive marker for subject, or technically a genitive marker on any of those, and then a mandatory pro-word, clitic, auxiliary verb thing that I'm just going to call the pro word. The bare minimum that you need to create a sentence, the verb and the pro word. And actually, sometimes all you need is the pro word. So here's a couple simple sentences with increasing complexity. You could just say yo, which means it is. Then you have kidmem ka, which means I woke up. Kachkayo, That's it. Brahma mutamk e. You entered the house. Naukma yattazanem ananalkajlak ao. My friend gave the pamphlet to him, and so on and so forth. On to the morphology. Arodjun features lots of options for derivational morphology for its nouns, adjectives, adverbs, and verbs. Word roots are usually pretty stable, so most of these derivational morphemes are prefixes or suffixes. Multiple prefixes and suffixes can be appended to root words to create new words, but the order of the morpheme definitely matters. To start, there are the countable and uncountable, which I also call physical and non-physical in a lot of the old documentation, and that's because a lot of the time I associated the the uncountable ones specifically with concepts rather than physical objects, and that still is a trend that is worth mentioning. You can still consider them the physical and non-physical to an extent, but really, practically, in actual linguistic terminology, they're countable and uncountable. You have ao, the singular neuter countable suffix, and awa as the plural. And then for the non-physical, there is no distinction between singular and plural, it's just a kha at the end. But most of the time, it's just nothing. Like in common words where roots end in consonants, nothing. But the kha is the underlying form. Even though you see on this table, or masculine, feminine, and neuter options here, there is no actual grammatical gender in Arodjun. The masculine and feminine endings are specifically for contextual reference as a way to avoid having to put in an entire extra word for another pronoun. And there's a lot of allomorphs, a lot of variations that you can see from this ao ending. And it's all phonetically derived based on the endings of the root words. The eu noun endings are formed rather sporadically. Most of the time you'll see it after a ma, but also not all the time, and these nouns are generally very common words and are considered irregular forms, and often I have them marked as irregulars in the Arodjun dictionary document. And then we have some derivational morphemes for people. So instead of the countable and uncountable endings, a person, or sometimes an inanimate object, can be given one of the following morphemes. Kind of dark, but a person considered to be of lower authority than the speaker could take the same suffix as a tool or device used to accomplish a task. That eat ending there, or the instrumental as I have it labeled. The uv suffix is the regnant or the highest authority, followed by in, which is the professional or the second highest level of authority, the generic honorific or the third highest authority, and then the instrumental. And then there's also the nationality and demonym suffix, which you see a lot, the nk. And then there's also some derivational morphemes for places, which don't have a distinction between singular and plural because these are usually used to name specific places. These are created using the root word, and then you put one of those on there instead of the default uncountable noun suffix. That goes away. Then you have the morphemes of definiteness, the articles, the demonstratives. Directly after the countability morphemes goes the article or demonstrative suffix. This determines whether the noun is definitive, indefinite. I don't know why I wrote definitive there. It's just definite. This determines whether the noun is definite, indefinite, proximal, distal, or even negative. And unlike the countability morphemes, a word does not need one of these articles. The default is the unmarked form, and these morphemes are only used to emphasize things or clarify things. The cases are nominative, accusative, dative, genitive, and animate genitive. The noun case suffix is applied after the countability and after the definite morphemes. For example, if you have feikau, which means night, then there's feikauj, a night, and then feikaujka is a night in the nominative case specifically. Audich is ancestry, audihbwa is of ancestry in the genitive. Reuchun, Rook City, Reelchunch, that Rook City, and Reelchunchmo, to that Rook City in the dative case. Then there are several noun prefixes, which are also split into a hierarchy. They can have their own polarity and intensity, changed with a sequence of prefix morphemes, which can also be stacked in a specific order. Each color represents the order in which up to 5 of these prefixes can be stacked from bottom to top. So you could have an extremely cursed most nonsensical, really, word that would technically be grammatically correct. You could say, the root word brau means entrance. So this word could mean the not lacking, greatly decreasingly ahead, above entrance. Or if you want to make it kind of make sense, you could say the entrance that is not lacking in its getting greatly less far away or high above the speaker. No one will ever say that. And you'll probably never see more than 2 of these prefixes on one word, but it is technically grammatical in this particular order, and speakers of this language do often try to stack together a bunch of these morphemes if they can't think of the actual word for something, but they want to try and get the concept across. Here's another noun with a lot of morphemes, this time color-coded. Which means for those not members of this big group, right? You could kind of see that word being used in a couple contexts. And as you can see, the converse and inverse prefix starts it. In this case, it's a t, the t meaning a lack of. The superlative scale prefix hu is on there to mean the big group. The root is refi, right there in green. Then you have the count of it, the plural countable ending chawa, right? Then you have the demonstrative suffix ka, which means this, and then you have the grammatical case, which is mo, or dative in this situation. And on to the adjectives and adverbs. They follow similar rules. Innate and perfect adjectives follow their associated nouns, but emphatic adjectives can precede their nouns, but they don't have to. Adverbs should follow their associated verb or adjective, though sometimes it can begin a clause acting as a single word adverbial phrase. There's the ja or jo prefix for the innate adjective, and the vya or vya prefix before a perfect adjective, and the prefix for an adverb is f or fe. So a lot of the time, if there is an incompatible sound cluster created by the union of a root word's final sound and another root word or a morpheme of any sort, epenthesis occurs, generally according to the patterns described in these tables to the left, depending on the grammatical category of the word. Adjectives and adverbs have a different set of rules than verbs and nouns as to which things get epenthesized on them and which things don't. So let's talk about a couple adjective and adverb examples. Here is watehyo, which means it's good, or you could say jo watehyo. They're the same thing. When an adjective is an argument in a copular clause, the jo prefix is optional and it's only used for clarification. Then you have nguhmail jajazya, which means I am an intelligent person. There's the jajaz, intelligent, following the noun it's associated with. But you could also say jaz nguhmailya, which means you're emphasizing the intelligent. That's the variable in this sentence that you're specifying. I'm an intelligent person. And a lot of interesting stuff happens in copular clauses, which we'll get into in a bit. So you have hwam fekyu tachkak-o. That's an adverb example right there, where with the fe prefix on q, which means bad. So fekyu is badly, goes right after the verb. But you could also say fekyu hwam tachkak-o, which means that happened badly. And after all this time, we should probably mention the pronouns, right? The pronouns for each case are irregular compared to those of normal nouns. You have your first person, which in the pronoun forms does have a difference between exclusive and inclusive, but that's, I think, the only case where that happens. Then you have your second person, singular and plural. You have your third person masculine, third person feminine, third person neuter, and third person specifically non-physical, if you're specifying that it's a uncountable noun. And all of those get the plural marker taupe, though technically you shouldn't really have many situations where you're trying to pluralize an uncountable noun, but it can happen. And then here are the genitives. Then you got your datives and your nominative or reflexives. Yes, these can be used in situations that are reflexive. I don't even know if I talk about that later. It's kind of complicated, the situations in which that happens, but there are reflexive pronouns, and they follow the exact same conjugations as this, because there is almost no situation where you would need to use these in the nominative except to emphasize something. And then there's the demonstrative or referential pronouns. It, this, and that. Now we gotta talk about those verbs a little bit more. We already mentioned that the M as an ending makes a verb intransitive, and that is the basis for the stress patterns, and that ma is transitive. But there's a bunch of others. There are various endings here. The when ending, replacing the ma, creates an entire subordinate clause. It's an extremely important little morpheme for the language. Additionally, the mme right there, the meh ending, upsets the stress pattern of the verb in a way that the others don't. That's why it includes both m's there. And it turns a root into a modal verb, or just an auxiliary verb in a way, one that directly affects another verb immediately after it. Then there are other morphemes that essentially act as prepositions. These alternative transitive verb suffixes fulfill specific roles. The first 7 are listed as various essive or locative forms related to the physical movement of the subject in relation to the object. Remember, these only happen in transitive clauses, so there has to be both a subject and an object. They fulfill the role of prepositions, but can also exist as independent words when expressing the relationship between two nouns, which I'll show in a bit. The last 4 are about similarities, how the subject commits an action in comparison to the object. To be like something, to be unlike, and to be the complete opposite of. Then, question words in transitive clauses are also typically expressed as suffix morphemes in the clause's verb. The question morpheme itself can act as the object of a sentence, or the object of the sentence can be expressed separately, as in the final example, right? So, for example, who did he kill? If you want to say, what are you saying? And so on and so forth. In copulas, the question words can exist without being connected to a verb, and it's usually just for simple questions that use only the clitic or the pro word, we'll talk about it, as the verb, right? So, who is it? Juero yo. What is it? Bana yo, etc. And now we're on to it. We have to talk about the subject tense pro word clitic thing. Whew, this is the most vital part of understanding Arodjun overall, as this thing contains the tense of the agent of every complete clause in the language. It can also act as a verb in its own right when no normal verb is present. So we need to talk a little bit about what it can do, but it can have a lot of morphemes appended to it that change its meaning. For example, this phrase right here, nyak emyahi, means y'all might not have tended to, because it contains a mood marker, a tense marker, the grammatical marking of the personhood of the subject, an aspect marker, and polarity. So let's talk about this a little more. What is it? A lot of people in the past really tried to tell me that it is a clitic, but I don't think it's a clitic on its own, because it doesn't depend on other words to exist. But both of the required components of it, the tense and the person of the agent, are clitics of each other. Neither of them can exist without each other, but the word does exist on its own in many different contexts. Is it a pronoun? No, because it doesn't act as a noun on its own. It acts as a verb on its own. And what about an auxiliary verb? This is actually probably the closest. It acts as a verb on its own, and all of the other verbs in the language require its presence to create a grammatical clause. So you could probably say that it is an auxiliary verb, if not the auxiliary verb of the language. The only verb that gets conjugated in a way. You know, it consists entirely of conjugation. But because of how different it is from all the other verbs in the language, how different it is from everything else in the language, I always just called it the pro word, and I call it that in the Arodjun grammar book too. And since this is my language, I think I'm just gonna stick with pro word. And I know like clitic may be tempting, but I think I'm gonna stick with pro word, because it is technically a verb, but it operates completely differently from all the other verbs in the language. As I'm sitting here in Basque country, I've actually noticed that the way the polypersonal agreement auxiliary verbs work is actually kind of similar to this. There's 2 of them, and those two are like required to make the whole freaking language work. I did not know that at the time, but that's actually probably the closest equivalent I can think of, except it doesn't include polypersonal agreement like it does in Basque. Right, so here is the conjugations of the pro word. Luckily, the patterns of person and tense are regular. Common phrases you may see that include just these pro words are these two religious phrases from the religion of Bez, and that is yak a wa, which means I am, I was, I will be, and its counterpart yok o wo. It is, it was, and it will be. Just some philosophical phrases used by followers of the Bez religion. And onto the aspects and moods. The names of the grammatical functions of these particles and suffixes has changed over time in my documentation, but I'm also pretty confident in saying that this is probably their final form, if not close to their final form. The unmarked form is a simple present, past tense, or future. In the indicative mood, though in the present, it's not so much indicative as it is more like a momentane kind of sense, referring to a single action, in contrast to the continuous and progressive marker that I haven't showed yet. And here they are, speaking of that. These two particles here, ja and vya, immediately precede the verb of a clause. Ja, followed by a verb, creates a continuous or progressive mood and can also be interpreted as creating a gerundative converb in certain circumstances. And then, vya, followed by a verb, creates a perfect mood or sometimes a passive voice in certain circumstances. So, a couple examples here. We have ja vidlamya, which means I am swimming, continuous marker, or progressive you could think of it as. I am currently swimming. And then you have vya vidlam ya, which means I have swam. Not I had swam, because that would have the pro word in the past tense. That would be vya vidlam ka. But vya vidlam ya means I have swam. Which takes us on to some copular clauses. There's some variations in the different kinds of copular clauses you can make, and they each yield what would certainly be different translations in English. So let's start with the first one, Zairan hao yo. It is a Zyran fruit. No case marking, just Zairan hao yo. Then you have Zairan hao mielka yo. Miao, which means food, is given the nominative marking, and thus that means you're saying the food is a Zyran fruit. Zairanhao jowiruhyo, which means it is the red-pink Zyran fruit. Alternatively, if you put the Zyran fruit into the nominative case and then take away the adjective's prefix, make it emphatic, then you're saying the Zyran fruit is red-pink, describing it directly. Additionally, you could also say wiruh Zyran hao yo, meaning it is the red-pink Zyran fruit, emphasizing the color of the Zyran fruit when you're trying to specify something to someone. And then a completely unrelated sentence, za myatao yo, and that includes a conjunction there. Za meaning it's like something. So if you have that without any other verb connected to it and it's just a copular clause, za myatao yo means it's like a box. Speaking of conjunctions, here are all of the many conjunctions. You'll see all these a lot. One of the most important ones are probably the first four. Wu is and within a clause, as in between two nouns or between two adjectives, between two adverbs, or even between two verbs, right? If it's within the same clause, the and is wu. But if it is an and that conjoins two separate clauses, entire clauses with their own verbs and pro words, then you use wa instead. Then you have tg, which is for. It's kind of like por in Spanish. It's for in exchange with, by is tg, and then for more in a Spanish para kind of sense, it means like in order to or for the purpose of, etc. And there's a bunch of others. Another very important thing is negation, which uses the word he in various different contexts. So you could add he as a suffix to the pro word, and that will negate the entire clause. You could have he before a verb, and that negates the verb, which has a similar but not entirely equivalent effect. Slightly different meaning there. And then doing both, creating a double negative, just stays negative. In fact, it emphasizes the negative. It makes it more negative. And that's actually really common. So it would make the whole sentence begin and end with he, as in this example down here below. Appending he to a noun, adjective, or adverb as a suffix after the countable marker, after the countability is specified, also negates them. So here's a sentence with a lot of he's in it. He aizom fewatahi yahi, which means he isn't badly prepared. Then you have the subordinator, when. I mentioned this a little bit before, but when is used to create a subordinate clause in a sentence, and it's used either as a verb suffix or as its own independent particle depending on the context. For example, here's a sentence, Yeronya benama mio raksika nyayai. And there the when is the suffix of the verb. It replaces the transitive or intransitive marker on the verb, and that specifies that the next chunk of the sentence there is going to have its own pro word and it's going to be subordinate to the main clause, right? That means I think that, yeronya, I think that. The when is essentially the that, and that's how I gloss it. It's glossed as that either as a suffix or as an independent word. You'll see it as that in my glosses. Makata ninuvem juk echai when ivyawema ninu juki kochai, which means, did you hear about the city judge who just became a district judge? And as you can see, when is its own word in there. It separates two clauses. The second clause is the subordinate clause, but since the primary clause already had an object in it, you needed to separate it and not pin that to the ending of the original verb. And thus, you can create nested clauses, right? And these nested clauses are usually created either with when or with the inai, like the for conjunction. They can create these nested clauses, and when is glossed as and essentially can be translated as that. It follows a noun phrase that requires another verb phrase or an entire clause to describe it. So here's an example. Pafama femichro jojawa wen jamyemka, which means almost 2 days have passed since I've eaten. That's a little weird construction in there, but the jamyem in the second sentence is a good example of job being used to create a gerundative, as I was talking about earlier. That sort of construction is used especially in situations like this, wherein a full clause would have yielded the same pro word twice in a row. Like that can't happen. That's considered ungrammatical. Inai, which is often glossed as for, and can be translated in the sense of Spanish's para or in order to. It follows a noun phrase that requires another verb phrase or an entire clause to justify it. Like in this sentence here, which means I should probably go this way to get back with my class. As in order to. It's listed in the gloss as for, just because that's one word rather than writing out in order to, but that is essentially the context. And that, all that follows the inai is a nested clause. So you'll notice from those two examples that I gave that there are not two of the pro words sitting next to each other. Those little subordinate clauses, those little nested clauses created by the when and inai markers, they do not have their own pro words in them. In fact, the language will bend backwards to not include another pro word in it. And that's when sometimes you'll get the reflexive pronouns and stuff like that. The pro words cannot grammatically exist next to each other in the same sentence. The solution for this involves creating verbal nouns using reflexive pronouns and or other subtle constructions. So back to that previous example, the incorrect version would be saying Pafama femichro jojawa wen miem ka. Can't do that. Do not do that. Instead, do Pafama femichro jojawa wen jamiem ka, which means, again, it's almost 2 days have passed since I've eaten. It more literally translates to almost 2 days have passed since eating, the event of eating. And I could go on with this. I've literally just scratched the surface, but God, it's getting really hot in this room. This has gone on for a while. I can make multiple separate videos on this. Perhaps I will. Perhaps I will make multiple separate videos just going into some of the nitty gritty of Arodjun. Maybe I'll make some more Arodjun 101 shorts as well, but God, if I started going into all the little peculiarities and grammatical forms, we'd be here forever. And this is meant to be a celebration and not a torture session. So if you want to know more, right, there's also on the Arodjun Google Sheet document, which is publicly available. If you go to nguh.org/languages/Arodjun, you'll see that there's a slang dictionary, which has a bunch of phrases, some of them pretty vulgar. But all of them have been used at least once in my writing, I think. Some of them I made up just for the sake of having stuff in the dictionary, but those are various slang phrases and things. That's pretty fun. Additionally, there's a whole bunch of other details about the numbers, including a full list of all the numbers in all of their forms. There are there's cardinal, ordinal, nominal, multiplier, fractional, collective, adverbial, distributive, and ordinal adverbial forms for numbers, all of which have slightly different suffixes and morphemes and patterns attached to them. Additionally, for all the various names on the map, in Arodjun at least, not all of them, I'm still working on it gradually, piece by piece, there are etymologies, what they mean, where they came from, etc. And there's also a burgeoning section on registers, idiolects, dialects, etc. I have most of a video script already put together to talk about the dialects of Arodjun during the time period of my comic Jajawa Jororch. So you can expect that at some point in the future. It's almost done, but there's a whole lot of complexities going into it. It's going to become way bigger than even what I currently have on the spreadsheet and what I have in the script. That's going to be a lot. And there's a bunch of other stuff on the Arodjun spreadsheet, and there's even more stuff in the Arodjun grammar book. I didn't even talk about the allophone patterns and the phonotactic constraints. There is so much in the grammar of the Arodjun language. Yeah, $25 US dollars on Amazon. Link in the description. As I end all of my showcases, I will do a sample text. But luckily, I've been making a comic called Jajawa Jororch, or Dog Days in English, for about 2 years now, and I'm only 2 chapters in. Don't talk about that. But you can read all of the comic on nguh.org/comic, and it will supplement your Arodjun learning experience by purchasing a grammar of the Arodjun language. You could have it all. It would be beautiful, and then you could become a better Arodjun speaker than me. So we're just going to go over a little segment from chapter 2 of the comic. I tried to choose the least spoilery section. I just wanted a section that I liked the artwork from, so I guess slight spoilers for chapter 2. It's like the beginning of chapter 2. It shouldn't be too spoilery, but go read the comic. I am proud of it. Zeye amankum ruetewa cueva vyaibim ninubuvkat cha hisiet mirhuewa johuehuen kleme purama hujofiku fepor hipaixinem yofekpoistech nyaimam yopechahum buasarbisiu io Nenmo maibim rue fabime kalama lepeninubuvkanya yu mohichawa nyaikoe Eye, Zan, makata kechai, iviawa maninuf jokich ninuf ka juhik o. Vechaihi viawa maninuf ejwa, okonyo via yim brich jitwait kanyawo, klemekionama jau bihwa, inairjach, bo. Eye mara, vorara ye rupnyo mara, jokok achai, hujetech o, fiboyum via tim. Eye Zan, voron ye nibo pekul kek chijimiare karkubuf kak uchai, oko! Churami entiva punkya. Kuhus jaze, jorpam juhawa viam yarhwa, fedrach viachem lachrka yu. When hakama kat yomya u yumya hi via minima via vork pao vechnyo sumya hawa yo. Zu punjo, fora ka waka abawa jokona. Wah, tepat siang cium jawab. Yum yum. San, san. Panim yo hibikesen in shot to lam re. Siapa wawa? I just noticed actually 2 spelling errors in the comic, at least according to the logic that I've presented in this showcase. I don't know if you noticed them, any little incongruencies. There's 2 of them, I think. Oopsies. if you paid attention and you noticed them, comment what my own mistakes were. I'd love to see it. Want more Arodjun? Yeah, I'm gonna make several videos in the future going over the dialects of Arodjun and various of the grammatical quirks that go into it, because it's a lot, and there's a lot of effort that I've put into it, so I might as well show off some of that too in separate videos. But if you haven't noticed, there's already a good amount of Arodjun language content that I've got around. First of all, there's the comic. Second of all, there's the Arodjun 101 videos, which I plan on making more of. There's a couple songs that I translated into Arodjun. Oh yeah, and my first video ever, and the first many videos on my channel were all about the development of Arodjun, or as I called it back then, Arodjun Katao with 2 U's. God, I'm so happy that I updated the orthography. Also, all of this and much more is on that Google sheet on nguh.org/languages/Arodjun. It's kind of slow accessing it from there, so if you really want to do an in-depth study, ask me to send you a link for it, and I'll send you a viewing link. It'll operate a little bit faster than looking at it on the website, but the point is, it's there on the website for everyone to use to learn and study as much as they may want to. And that's it. Thank you all for an amazing 5 years, half of a decade. How many of you have been here since the beginning? You've been with me for half a decade. I was like, I looked so young and hopeful before the world ground me down. Life has been crazy. I got married in May. I moved to the Basque country, and I'm starting to learn Basque. And now I figured on this 5-year anniversary of my first video on this channel, I should make the Arodjun showcase for real. So here's to another 5 years. Can we get Agma Schwa to the decade mark? Who knows? Only time will tell. We'll see. But here I am in Basque country, and I appreciate all of you. And I'll see you guys soon for some fun, juicy things. Many things are ahead. Very wacky adventures are nigh. Cursed Conlang circus, and a lot of other things that you don't know about. The things you don't know. Don't you wish you knew? I bet you do, but you don't. But you will, if you subscribe. And you'll know a little early if you become a patron on patreon.com/nguh. Thank you all for 5 years of Nguh. Siangke Tijipurim. Thanks for watching. The YouTube captions are gonna love this one.